I think we can start, right? Let me take this off. All right. So welcome back. Let's summarize what I did in the first class about production. Let me actually start by adding something that I forgot to say during the first lecture on production. I think it's important. In common, because it creates a lot of confusion. In common parlance, people, and also old economists in the 17, 18, thought about production or used the word production to denote what we would call probably manufacturing, okay, or the industrial sector. That's not the sense in which terminology is used in economic theory these days. So, for example, if you read all the classical economists, even studied from the physiocrats and forgot about mercantilists, you will see that in debating where value comes from and what's valuable, what's not valuable, they actually go to the extreme of saying, oh, only the productive activity add value. So the trading activity, the commercial activity don't add value. They're valueless. They just redistribute value around, whatever that means. It's very strange, actually, if you think of it. You know, there are entire passages of very smart people debating on the fact that buying something in a place and then transferring it some other place and time does not add value to it, which is and then at the same time in the same book, a few chapters before or later, saying that prices depend on demand and supply. And you wonder, why would one think the spices, for example, which were a big trade over that period and the centuries before, they were all grew in Pacific area and Indian Ocean area, and they were transported to Europe where they had a lot of value, and they were transported at very big risk, right? Why would their activity not have value, right? To make the goods available at the place and time in which people need them is, you know, equally valuable as producing them. It's pretty useless to produce things that then you put in place and time. But anyhow, that was the view. So it's very, I don't know, interesting, I think, to read the various elaboration and discussions about this. Now, in modern economic theory, we understand, and I think this is a true advance, that because there is no intrinsic value, that's why I started out from value and prices, then anything that takes some inputs and turn it into some output that somebody may want, that's production. Right now, there are about 50 people consuming the production we're carrying out. And in fact, we're all inputs of this production. The room, the computers, the student themselves, to the extent that they ask questions, they participate, and myself. This is an act of production, right? Maybe not something very valuable, but it's an act of production. Well, apparently people enjoy it. We have thousands of people watching the videos on YouTube, and then they say, oh, that's so interesting, blah, blah, blah. So when Foscari should ask for royalties. All right, but so that's very important to keep in mind. That a lot of silly debates get eliminated if you understand that, you know, production is any use or anything to turn something input into something output. That is to modify object or states of a person or whatever in such a way that something useful, I guess, is produced. Not even, it doesn't even have to be useful. In fact, in the theory of production, we will not have time because it's an introductory course, but a key aspect of the theory of production is to study the situation in which, in presence of joint production, which is rather common, you produce something useful and something damaging, right? the old debate about CO2 or pollution in general is a debate about production activities that have joint production. They produce something that people like, say transportation from point A to point B, beef, grape Fiorentinas, and gases that apparently are damaging the environment and so on, right? Or plastic and so on. That's a classical case of joint production. You produce two or more things. Some of them are priced positively, others are not priced, and you're trying to price them negatively. Okay? That's production as well. So pretty much anything you do can be read as a theory of production. So not just factories, right? A bar is part of the production activity. People selling on the street are part of the production activity. Anybody that trades something from a place to another is part of a production activity. They're just very different. Okay. So this is quite important. So when I talk about the production activity, I have in mind everything. Okay. And production takes place over time. There's no sense in talking about production and eliminating the time dimension. I mean, you can try to do it at a very elementary stage, or sometimes too much. Some national income account data, you model production as if it occurs within the same period, but then that period is long. It's a month, a quarter, a year, okay? But at least at the theoretical level, if you want to understand the theory of production, you need to put time into it. Things are transformed, and this requires time. The inputs are transformed into outputs, and this requires time. The other important thing is that economic theory per se has very little to say about the engineering aspect of production. It's very fashionable, especially in business school, to talk a lot about fashionable theories of production. And because engineering methods, production methods, delivery methods, inventories management methods, and so on and so forth, change quite often as a part of the technological change. As a matter of fact, we'll discuss it later today. You will have often lots of changes in the way people model production. Economists don't talk, for example, about Industry 4.0. Why? Because from an economic point of view, Industry 4.0 is like Industry 3.0, or 3.2, or 1.6, or 6.9. Okay? There is nothing particular in the engineering aspect, or in the changes in engineering, the fact that you use numeric control machinery or robots or whatever, or digital method of storing information. From the economic point of view, that's certainly a very relevant, I say engineering to include a bit of everything, engineering aspect of the whole thing, but it doesn't really change the essence of economic analysis. Or maybe it does, but I haven't noticed, nor anybody has pointed out quite clearly why it should be changing the economic analysis. There's a lot of literature, I have to say, especially in the last few years, that seem to get captured by technical, I would say, geeky aspects of technological change and confuse them with structural economic modification, which I don't think take place. But this is maybe my opinion or my way of reading the way we study the problem. And if you disagree, please say it. In any case, the way we look at production is that there are technologies. I will go back to what I explained last week about what a technology is. And then there are social mechanisms, which includes property rights, the different distribution of property rights, bargaining power, legislation, rules that you have to follow, okay? And they define the way those technologies are used. and they determine incentives for cooperation or non-cooperation. Please. We'll talk about innovation. Innovation is an event, right? What's innovation? Innovation is when, well, later on I'll define innovation, but let's try to define it now. What is an innovation? How would you define an innovation? Well, let's think for a moment together. People online are invited to think too. You can say, contribute a suggestion. So what's when do I talk about an innovation? That's one implication. Let's try to be very abstract. Sometimes it's useful, right? An innovation means that you innovate, you do something new. So whenever I carry out something that has economic relevance in a way that is different from the way it was carried previously, I'm innovating, right? Later at the end of the class, I will point out that there is a way of looking at technological change, or many people have been advocating that we should look at technological change using the tools of biology, in particular genetics. And so think of innovation as mutation. I think it's a reasonable way of looking at it. My view is, my reading of that proposal is that it doesn't add much to our understanding of innovation from an economic point of view, but it's certainly a way of looking at it, right? And innovation is a mutation. A mutation in a living being, or actually not necessarily in a living being, in any, yes, in a living being, I said something stupid, is when you change anything in the genetic code so that some characteristics of the being are modified. Well, we can think the same about goods and technologies. And innovation is I change a little entry, bing, very small modification. I produce something with a different color, for example. And this may be successful or not, we will see. It doesn't have to be necessarily successful, right?
Isn't it like still important trying to understand how technology develops, for instance, with regards to macroeconomic models and the fact that technology represents like an important share of the factor of the growth of the
Oh, absolutely. No, we will get to that. But there is nothing we can, I mean, nothing economical about the fact that James Watt modified the traditional steam engine by adding the external, what is the name, where the steam goes to, right, and made it more efficient. There is nothing economic in, or there is nothing that economists can say about the way in which the new chip is being designed. The only thing we can look is ask if this has economic consequences. Right? So there is a lot of, in my opinion, of pseudo expertise, because it's pseudo, being spent by social scientists in general, blabbering about technological change when we know nothing about it. So there's nothing I can say about new generation nuclear power and the way in which nuclear generator may or may not be adjusted. That's something that I'll let other experts do. I may look at the economic consequences of it. Yeah, go ahead. Right. I agree that maybe we'll get yeah, that's an interesting point. So I'll get to that. In fact, the last part of the lecture has to do exactly with that. If it is random or if it is not. Some people we'll get to that because that's an interesting aspect. You had another question. You had a question, Thomas? No.
Shouldn't we like ask ourselves these like how often innovation or technological change, how often that it happens, or how often it has happened in the past?
Yes, well, let's get to that. Yeah. But the thing I wanted to stress is that, interestingly, as you will see, economists pretty much until the early 20th century did not pay much attention to technological innovation. In fact, the only one that paid a bit of attention seriously to it was Karl Marx, which had its own way of looking at it, but he was the one that realized that it was the most important novelty that had come around during the 19th century and the 18th century as well, and he was focusing his attention there. In a funny way, we'll discuss it momentarily. But before that, it was a bit absent from economist thinking. Interestingly, in recent years, it seems to have become everything, and you have economists talking a lot about technological change as if, on one hand, they are engineers, and on the other, this has to do with the predictability and randomness, we can actually tell where it's going. And as I will try to argue, I think that's a lot of bullshit, very frankly. But we'll see, okay? But for now, the thing I wanted to point out is this, right? That we are concerned with this aspect. We are concerned with mechanisms, with incentives, with the fact that in production there may or may not be cooperation, there may or may not be a hierarchy, with the distribution of value added and so on. In fact, the initial concern, the way in which production was modeled by the classical economists and by those that before them, was purely concerned with the distribution of value added. Right? You see, until Marx, in fact, let me say, actually, until Varra, okay? When economists look at production activity, what is that they looked at? They said, oh, production is that thing that produces value added. How do we break it up? How do we give a piece to the landowner, a piece to the worker, a piece to the capitalist? How does the merchant get paid? Where does the government take it? It's value added. It was all about distribution of value added, which is why, for a long time, the theory of value was the main concern, right? The way they thought was there is economic activity and production generates value. So they had different opinion as to what was valuable, as this I have said repeatedly. But every economist until Marx or Varra thought this set of activities produce value. And to produce value, they use these inputs. And then this value gets distributed to the inputs. What is right? What is wrong? Who gets what? You know, is the rent a residual? Is the profit a residual? Are wages subsistence wage, or are they more than subsistence wage? Is the value of an object composed only of the labor put into it, or also other things? Does the merchant add value to an object by moving it from one place to another? That was the old way of thinking about the economic activity before Varra, I would say. Yeah, so this I already said. This is a bit of to get people back from last class, because last class was 2 weeks ago. I am sure that lots of you are familiar with this thing, the aggregate production function. I will talk very little about it. If I had more time, I would try to show you how you derive the aggregate production function from the more essential and I think more interesting components that I've been illustrating, called activities. I don't think we will have the time, so I will have to leave it that hanging in the air for the interested. But yes, I have to insist, the aggregate production function is a bad tool. It's a very delicate tool, and it should not be taught to young students. I think we do a very bad service to ourselves by teaching aggregate production function at early stage of people's career. But that's the way it is. National income accounting is unfortunately written with production function in mind. Instead, I think that the proper way to think of production is to think in terms of activities, which is algebraically more complicated because you have to use more symbol, but it's analytically simpler. Every production activity can be described by an activity in the technical sense of the word. So obviously the word activity, right, in common parlance means we're doing something. Right? Activity means that something is being done by somebody. The word in which we use it is known as the sense in which we use the word activity is defined by activity analysis. I think it's one of the reading I put in the original list. If not, find it. It's a very nice Wikipedia page on that. Activity analysis is a method, a technique, an area of research that grew substantially in between the two wars as modern factories became more and more sophisticated, and engineers and control theorists and so on started to think, well, we can try to use some scientific mathematical methods to organize production. It had already started, right? But they tried to come around with a bit of formalization. And then activity is just what I indicate there. It's two vectors, or a vector, if you want, with two parts. The first part is a very long list of inputs, and the second part is a very long list of outputs. And how to make a cup of coffee is one activity. And as you notice, to make a cup of coffee can be achieved with very different technologies, right? For each technology, there is a different activity. So to make a cup of coffee is a very good example because it would allow us to think, but if you don't think it's general enough, stop me and say, no, but this other production activity would not fit the method you're proposing, Boldrin, okay? So if we're making a cup of coffee at home for two people, what is that we do? Well, we reach for, in Italy, in other countries, you reach for a different machine. So there are many technologies to make coffee for two people, but in Italy, they reach for a mocha. And in the big set of mochas that every good Italian kitchen have, they go for the small one, unless they want to drink really a lot of coffee, okay? But if they want 2 regular cups of coffee, they go for the one that makes 2 cups of coffee. Okay, so you need that. That's a machinery. Then you need some burning object or some induction thing, and again, different technology, but you need that. And then you need some water, a certain quantity of water, put in a specific place. And then you need some coffee powder, and then you also need to know that you have to actually twist and turn so that you screw the top on the bottom. Some people forget, and then comes out, right? You have to make sure that the rubber is properly in its place and it's in good condition. If it is ruined, that also may cause damage. So there's a lot of stuff. So it also implies that there is a human being among the inputs, at least one. And the human being is not a generic human being. It must be a human being with certain skills. So it's not just a random, no, a random 7 minutes of a generic human being. No, if I get an Eskimo that has not been watching Italian movies probably, and has not been exposed to the Italian way of making coffee, he will find it very hard. If I get a Turkish lady that is used to make coffee the Turkish way, she will be looking for her types of machines. So you need actually a little bit of skilled labor. And then if you put all these things together, after n minutes, you get your cup of coffee. Okay? So that's what those X's are. And on the right, the Y1 are the 2 cups of coffee, and the Y2 is the used coffee powder, and the Y3 is the dirty mocha, and the Y4 is some residual in the air of the gas burning. Okay, that's the way we describe a production activity. That's the way I think an engineer will describe a production activity. I claim that everything we do that turns something into something else can be described like that. It's a bit boring, but it allows you to see the essence of what's going on. And in particular, if you take it very seriously, you notice one thing, that given an activity, a technology is defined. In some sense, they have the same meaning from an economic point of view. So, for example, here we are making a cup of coffee for 2 people in an Italian kitchen. And 2 more people come around. Now we have to make coffee for 4 people. Well, we have 2 options. One option is to replicate. That is, to take 2 mochas, 2 fireplaces, twice the time of an individual. So no 7 minutes, but 14, okay? That is, we can just replicate, double everything, twice the water, blah, 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 and we get twice the output. And every entry will be double, right? We will have double coffee, double powder to be thrown away, double dirty mochas, and so on. Or we can decide to change technology. We look up the cupboard and there is a bigger mocha. One that makes 4 cups, and we reach for that. See innovation? That's innovation. Or maybe in this case, it's adoption. We'll debate about that too later. In the sense that there were 2 technologies available to make 4 cups of coffee. One was the replica of the technology for 2, just done it twice. The second is the technology that seems to be fit for 4. Now, what's the difference? The difference is that apparently the one for 4, the second technology, is more efficient, right? If I have to make 4 cups of coffee, that one is more efficient. For example, I save on labor. The amount of time it takes to handle a mocha for 2 is the same that it takes to handle a mocha for 4. Exactly the same human capital. And so if I have to make 4 cups of coffee, better use the one for 4, because the other one would require twice the amount of labor, and that's expensive. Theoretically, the amount of water double, but for example, I use less capital because there is a volume involved, and the amount of steel, blah, 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 in a mocha for 4 is less than twice the amount of steel in a mocha for 2. And you can cheat a bit on the powder too and save a coffee, but that's another story. Okay, that is, you don't use double the amount of coffee powder. So it's more efficient, but notice it's a different technology. And in fact, there are mochas for 6, and if you get it, and then there are different machines, right? If you want a little foam on top, you gotta use your espresso machine and blah, 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 okay? Every time you change activity, you also change the technology. So basically, technology is defined by an activity and vice versa. And a property of an activity is this one that you can replicate. Ideally, I can make coffee for millions of people with that technique. All I need is to have millions of copies of those inputs. I need millions of mochas for 2, millions of fireplaces, millions of 7 minutes of a human being that knows how to use it, millions of whatever water, and blah, blah, blah. Okay? The replicability argument that goes back to John Hicks. Okay? It's a very strong logical argument. And one say, okay, come on, but it's ridiculous. People don't do it in practice. Yes. Obviously, people don't do it. Well, depends, we'll see. All right? But the reason they don't do it is because they decide to adopt something. And so if I focus on the fact that once an activity and a technology are very well specified, Then replicability is a logical consequence, which means that this thing, I'll explain it formally in a moment, that we call return to scale, okay, are constant by definition. Once I have properly defined technology, that's something I learned. And I also learned that therefore the possibility of innovating is a decision. See what I mean? If one looks at coffee making without thinking and goes and notices that when there are two guests coming, somebody's asking a question, hold on a second. Fulvio. Yeah, is the way we produce something. Sorry, Fulvio, I hadn't seen that you had sent a. You guys can open your microphone, those people that are online, and it's fine. You can open your microphone and speak like Stefania did before. So, you know, many people, if they look at the situation in which, well, I have two people coming over for coffee and I use the mocha for two. I have two people coming over for coffee, use the mocha for two. And then one day, 6 people come over for coffee and I don't use the mocha for 2, 3 times. I use the mocha for 6. And people say, see, there is increasing returns in coffee making. There's no increasing returns in coffee making. It's just that coffee making allows, or has allowed, given that they already exist, for a set of innovations that has produced a variety of different technologies for coffee making. Some are more efficient in certain circumstances, some are less efficient in those circumstances, and as circumstances change, you adopt a different technology. And it will also depend on relative prices. In the old days, nobody had an espresso machine at home because they were very expensive. And it was difficult to make small espresso machines that a normal household could buy and install in the kitchen, right? So if you want to have the espresso style coffee, you have to go to the bar with a big huh? Now they have the little stuff. Now it's wild. That makes it convenient also at home. Right? The game, it's not that they have introduced increasing return in espresso making. These are just, innovation. And depending on what the relative prices are, you use one or the other. Okay? Why am I saying this? Well, I'm saying this because in the last 40 years, but for a long time, there's been a huge debate about the presence or the lack of increasing returns in production or decreasing returns. So we should start thinking seriously about that and try to have a theory of what increasing return is and what decreasing returns are. My claim, very strong claim, but it's the classical claim, is no, there are no increasing returns technologies. And in fact, there are no decreasing returns technologies. All technologies, when properly specified, are constant returns. Increasing return, what we seem to take as increasing return, and this is truly a challenge to anybody listening to me, please contradict me and give me a counterexample. Increasing returns are due to innovation. That is what we think or we take as increasing return is purely technological change. Adoption of a different activity. Decreasing return, the same, is due to some factor being scarce. So for example, and I'll get to you in a second, think again at the example of coffee making for 2, right? So I need machine, the gas, the fire, blah, 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 and the person that knows how to use it. And need 5 minutes of that person. Now assume I want to start and produce 4 cups of coffee using that technology. But the 4 cups of coffees, I want to produce them in 7 minutes on the clock. So I cannot have the same guy to do it sequential. That's a different object, right? Because that's 2 cups of coffee in 7 minutes and 2 cups of coffee in 14 minutes. We just said that goods at different places and time have different value. In fact, 2 of the guests will have to wait for 7 minutes. And in fact, typically, if we have a circumstance like that, there is only 1 mocha in the house and only 1 person that can make coffee, right, and only 1 fire, you know, you will be courteous and say to the important person among the 4, oh, you go first, you get the first cup of coffee, I'll get the second. Why? Because the second is worth less. You have to wait 7 more minutes. In fact, a bit more because you have to wash it, blah, blah, blah. You have to wait 10 minutes more. It's worth a little bit less, right? So the 2 important will get the first 2 cups and the less important will get the second 2 cups. There will be all these gestures of courtesy. No, please, I just had mine, don't worry. I'm just taking it for the pleasure, all this kind of bullshit, right? So they're different goods. So if one was to be really serious and produce 4 equivalent cups of coffee, they have to come at the same time. So I need the 2 processes to run in parallel. True? No, right? I am talking about one technology. I'm trying to explain decreasing return. How do I have decreasing return given that the replicability argument says, well, just double it up, right? The replicability argument says, well, use 2 mochas, 2 sets of water, blah, 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 and move it in parallel, you'll get 4 cups of coffee within 7 minutes from start. But you need 2 human beings, right? Because one takes care, yeah, I can't, even I am pretty good at making coffee. I'm sure everybody else is. I don't think you can simultaneously set 2 mochas, right? It's kind of complicated. I don't think you can do it, right? Turn on the 2 fires, put the, no, it's not gonna work. And 3, definitely it's not gonna work, right? So eventually there is a number, the replicability at a certain point runs out of hands. But well, let's just do it with 2. You need 2 people. What if then one of the input, the 7 minutes of a person that knows how to use the mocha and the fire are not available because there is only 1 person in the room that actually has ever seen a mocha and a fire before. All the other enjoy coffee, but they have no idea whatsoever how to make it. We will observe decreasing returns, right? We will observe that the output per unit of time will go down, right? If we look, well, I have 2 mochas, well, I have 2 fires, well, I've doubled the water, I've doubled the coffee, I've doubled the spoon, but there is this guy moving between the 2, and it takes actually 9 minutes of his time or 10 minutes of his time to get 4 coffees at the end. And we call that decreasing returns. So the second statement that I'll make is decreasing returns are always due to 1 or more factor being scarce, being in limited supply, being finite. Notice that this is the old Ricardo intuition again, right? As you remember, we've been using his whole story of the land, inframarginal land, many times. It comes up again. His point was, yeah, it would have been lovely to have land of the best quality in unbounded amount, because then we'll have constant return in agriculture. But we don't, so we have to use land of a lower quality, and then we'll see decreasing return. You had a question before I started this.
The point of I trying to make a logic, I feel like both part of this measure, it's doing something very hard to measure. So if you want to analyze production, how
exactly. In fact, I noticed that's why, in fact. So we will see there is another way in which people have tried to measure technological change, non-technology, technological change. We'll talk about TFP later. But in fact, exactly because the word technology does not point to something measurable, I have observe that in economic analysis, we identify a technology with an activity. And an activity is just an ordered couple of vectors, the inputs and the outputs. And those are measurable, right? So what's a technology? A technology is this specific list of inputs and this specific list of outputs. And the specific list, remember, includes the type of labor you use and how long it takes. Right? So technology for making coffee is different from technology for making pizza. It takes a different unit of time, and technology for making a pair of shoes takes a different amount of time, and so on. So yeah, the word technology, in fact, is ambiguous. It has different meanings in different contexts, in different analytical fields, and the way the proper way to use it in an economic context is by identifying that we say, I have a technology to make butter. I mean, I have one or more activities fully described with inputs and outputs, and in the outputs there is butter. That's what I mean.
Professor, one point. So just following your argument that technology is ambiguous. So what I think is decreasing return to scale because there is a decay factor in the technology. If I think at the mocha machine, at a certain point, the mocha machine will not produce as much or good coffee as a new mocha machine.
Oh, but that's not decreasing return. That's called depreciation.
Okay, a decay factor, indeed.
Yeah, in some, that's a very good point. In fact, that's one thing that's a very good point. But again, you see, that's good because that shows, what it means to take seriously. I said it somewhere. You want to take very seriously the idea that a technology is a very specific and clear engineering style description of all the inputs and the outputs. An engineer, if you show him or her a machine, brand new, perfectly functioning, and an older one with some parts that have been worn out, with some maybe some parts are not functioning or have become somewhat obsolete, will not treat the two things as if they're the same. They're two different machines, and therefore they're two different technologies. I agree. But again, we don't want to confuse the two things, right? We don't want to treat as decreasing returns the fact that as I use machineries, instruments in general, human beings as well, I have some form or another of depreciation. Let's just call depreciation in general, right? Human beings depreciate as well. In fact, this also implies, so for example, in the theory of, traditional theory of labor supply, right? We tend to say that labor supply is elastic because people have fatigue, disutility from work. So that's another example like yours, right? The machine has been worn out, the person is tired. The same person, if he has a bad day, which all kind of couples of friends are dropping by and they all want a cup of coffee, and he started to make coffees at 3 p.m. and now it's 6 p.m. and there are still friends dropping by for 15 minutes and they want a cup of coffee. He may actually get tired and pissed for making cups of coffees, and so he's no longer the same person that at 3 p.m. started to make the first mocha. He's very tired and nervous. He wants to throw the mochas on their face. So it's a different technology. Okay, so that's the silly version. The real version is, in the factory, especially when working in the factory was hard and there were no robots, the worker after 6 hours of work or even 5 was much higher respect to the worker at the beginning. The workers after 8 hours was definitely very much tired and therefore produced less. But it's not that technology per se had decreasing return. It was that person got tired. That person had decreasing return because in some sense, as he got more and more tired during the day, it became another person from the point of view of ability to work. Right? If I run a marathon, after the marathon, I'm tired. I'm not the same athlete. You cannot tell me, well, let's run another marathon. In fact, after 10 kilometers, I'm probably tired. But that's Yeah, the invitation here that I make is to be very careful at separating the two things. Now, obviously, there are circumstances, but here we go on a more delicate territory, in which one can say, well, for the purpose of what I'm studying, let me just assume decreasing returns, even if what I know is people get tired, the machine gets worn out, the space available is no longer the same, the land gets worse and worse, and so on, right? So in fact, what I'm doing is changing technology, but I can treat it as decreasing return. You right with me, Alessandro?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Why do you think it's so important to be so strict on the fact that there have to be just constant terms of scale? Why is it so inefficient to talk about increasing and increasing?
Oh, I'll show you in a moment. I'll show you in a moment. Let's see. I'm sorry for those that are not in the class, because I don't think I can, let me see if I can point the camera. You see the whiteboard, I think. Let me take away this. So your friend asked, why am I so stubborn about increasing, decreasing returns, right? Let me take a very standard situation about which people talk about all the times, especially in the theory of business side. So let's use the aggregate production function, in which there are decreasing returns, right? Capital and labor, everybody has seen that, right? Now, in fact, how do you draw the aggregate production function on a plane like this, where there's aggregate capital and aggregate labor? You do something like this. You see that's an isoquant, that's an isoquant for higher output, right? Everybody's seen this? And you say, well, right now we're here, we're using this combination of capital and labor, right? L1, K1. And if there is a change in relative price due, for example, to reduction in fertility or reduction in, right now, for example, what's going on in the economy. For a variety of circumstances, there has been a reduction in labor supply, right? The missing workers. Lots of millions of people are not going back to work, even if, let me cite myself, I'm not sure I said it in this class, but I know I said it in many videos recently. The reason there's a lot of people not going back to work has nothing to do with fear of COVID, has to do with money in the bank because of the subsidies that came from the federal government. It's certainly true in the United States. Did you notice what happened this month? You didn't. They're running out of money. 500,000 people went back to work. Bing! The disappeared work and reappeared. And you will see they'll keep reappearing for the months to come. But anyhow, that's another story. That's a polemical argument for those that hadn't noticed that. But it's not by chance. The payment have been over for a few months. People are running out of money, they go back to work. But there has been a reduction in labor supply. So what is that your standard model with decreasing returns says? Oh, no problem. There's not enough labor. Salaries will go up and we'll move here, right? We'll move from this position to this position along the isoquant. We'll use L2, K2 combination, right? And output will stay constant. There will be no reduction in output, right? That's the story. And this should be happening rather quickly. Why? Because the isoquant is there. And I say, no, notice it never happens. This is always the problem. They call it adjustment. It's not happening. It's not happening. Why? Because the isoquant It's not that the isoquant does not exist in the sense that silly people say it does not exist. The isoquant exists, it's a theoretical creation. Okay, exactly like the activities and the technology. But this that we were using was a certain activity and a certain technology. It used a combination of, it was written like this, use K1 and L1, you will obtain Y1 and some other stuff. That was the activity. Input, output. Okay? So we were here. This is the way you draw an activity in the isoquants, right? By looking, like, it's 2 dimensions, so only 2 inputs, right? And the output you measure it on the famous film that comes out here. That's a projection. This indicated an activity. If I have to move here, I have to use a different activity, a different technology. And that requires adoption. Absolutely, there is no doubt that we can do a lot of the stuff we did before with fewer workers. And in fact, the process is in place. In those sectors where the withdrawal of labor supply has been stronger, people have tried, people, managers, whoever was running the companies, even the bars, have tried to learn ways of producing the same amount of output with less labor. To do that was not automatic. They had to come up with a different technology, which meant different organization of labor, different machinery, different rules, different procedures. I remember a long conversation with an Italian entrepreneur who was a successful owner of restaurant in Miami back in March this year. And he said, well, yeah, you know, a lot of my plain workers are not working. We have a huge reduction of the cheap labor supply. People that clean the tables, bartenders, people that clean in the kitchen, blah, 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 because of the pandemics. And so we are adapting. We're trying to figure out different ways to do. I have bought new machines. We're learning. And he says, well, it's working now. But we've been struggling for 8 months to try to figure out things among various restaurants owners here. And now that we're learning the way and finding the tricks, yeah, the funny thing is that when those people will come back and ask for the job, I will have to say, no, sorry, I changed technology. Your job is gone. But we'll get to that later. But the point that I'm making is that going from here to here is not a transition along a smooth isoquant for a given technology due to decreasing returns. It's going from one activity to another. That's a different activity. That's activity number 2, and this is activity number 1. And to go from here to there is costly. You have to invent that, you have to adopt it, you have to create the new inputs. Some inputs are different, even if it's the same cook as before. The new cook, she has to use fewer pots to cook because the guys that are doing the cleaning of the pots are no longer available. So we have to save time on cleaning the pots. And so you have to learn a different skill, which means you become a different worker, which means it's a different technology. Nothing to do with increasing return, decreasing return, it has to do with innovation. And so when in many business cycle instances, we say, why? The model predicts there should be capital labor substitution. Why is it not happening instantaneously? Well, it's not happening instantaneously because you have to adopt the new technology. And adopting the new technology is costly and requires time, and therefore it does not happen instantaneously. Whereas if it is just a matter of decreasing return, it will happen instantaneously. You just move along the answer. That's the point. It's relevant. I stress it because it's relevant. Because it allows you to, in my opinion, understand better what happens, At a minimum, there are two different interpretations.
Sorry, Prof.
But
Moving from point A1 to another activity, for example, will be...
Fulvio, hold on. Because of the, how can I say, quality of the audio in this room, you have to speak very slow, much more slowly than I do, because otherwise we cannot separate your words. Can you start again?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. No, I was saying that if you move from an activity, A1, for example, to another one, the cost of this action, it's always positive, or it will be also negative, that it means that will be a profit for us to move on.
Okay, I understood. Well, he's asking, in moving from an activity to another, is it always costly? Could there be a profit? I doubt there could be a profit. So there is a quick answer, which is half of a joke. It's not fully a joke, but it's only half of the answer, which is, if in moving from activity 1 to activity 2, I make a profit at the given prices, then I should have done it before. Okay? In other words, if 2 was so much more efficient than 1 that I could have made a profit by moving to it, well, then I would have done it before. So that's the quick observation. The more careful observation is the following. Here we assume that I am operating at activity 1 for given supply of various factors of production and their prices, right? And that's the activity among those I know that maximize my profits, or at least minimizes my cost. Okay. So hold it. In the moment I move because circumstances change. So either some price change or some factor supply changes, or, which is strict innovation, I learn something completely new that I did not know before, and I go, oh, Jesus, I could do things better. But obviously, you know, there is a cost in there, which is I learned something. I mean, we may not want to perceive it as a cost, but from the economic point of view, it's a cost. I spent some time learning something. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking that, but we are assuming that we are always at the optimum. But it is true. Maybe we aren't using something that can point an optimum, or I don't know if this assumption that we always do the best is something that I can rely on.
No, we don't need to assume that we're always doing the best in. So this is something we discussed, I think, at the beginning when we were talking about rationality. You see, consider this. I don't have to make this assumption that we always live in the best of all possible worlds. It's not needed at all. All I need to assume is this person is not trying to hurt herself. Okay? So in the moment they're using activity 1, they must have a reason to do so. Unless I assume they're completely stupid and they just do things randomly. Sure. Okay. One hypothesis is people do things randomly, completely random, without purpose, without planning, without thinking. We can certainly use that, but then the evolution, that's one way of taking the evolutionary approach. You know, I have 1 million firms, I throw technologies at them randomly, right? And they just adopt them. Some technologies are very bad, and some technologies are very good. Fine, that's an acceptable way of starting. I don't think it's very useful, but let's assume. For sure, sooner or later, those guys using the very bad, inefficient technology will disappear, because that's actually an implication of this biological model, right? There is selection, so the people with the bad technology are like people with bad genetics. They are mutation, but they are defective mutation. They're being dominated in that environment, therefore they do not reproduce, they disappear. So the same will happen in our world. Okay, so let's start now in our world and have a bunch of people that have survived, each one of them has a technology. If I now observe one of them changing, again, I can assume that it's random and everything is always random, but then I don't really have a theory of anything. I'll get to this later because I have the last 2 slides about the biological approach. The point of biological approach is that the theory of nothing. Yeah, humans are like plants. Good. So let's shut down any study of humans. Let's treat them as plants and let's go back to botanics. But if there is anything intentional in this person, in moving from 1 to 2, they must have a reason. So even if it is not the best of all possible world, this person must be moving from 1 to 2 because it thinks it's convenient. All I ask is convenience, right? Maybe there is 3. 3 is even better, but the guy is stupid, doesn't know, or has not studied enough, or the news didn't come, never went to this school, whatever. Millions of reasons you may not know something. You see what I mean? It doesn't. We don't need to assume the best of all possible world. We just need to assume some common sense rationality, very basic.
Yes, no, I meant that we rely on that we share the same information. Because, for example, if I have another information different from, I can use this to have an advantage on you.
Absolutely. If you don't
Yes.
have the same information, you don't use the same technology. That's
Okay.
because, that's before I said quite clearly, among the inputs of a technology, so that's a useful question. Among the input of a technology, there is labor. And it's not, as I said before, it's not generic labor. It's specific labor. It's labor that knows some stuff.
Okay.
So, yeah, sure, maybe in the kitchen, you know, maybe I'm just Airbnb. Okay, so let's have it. I did Airbnb my house when I was on sabbatical in St. Louis. And in the kitchen, I have all kinds of tools to make coffee. I have probably 10 Italian mochas. I have the Turkish machine, and I have a beautiful espresso machine. And I think my second guest, American, called me right away and said, there is no machine to make coffee. I said, what do you mean there's no machine to make coffee? There's about 15 machines to make coffee. He said, no, where is it? So what do you mean, where is it? It's in front of you. Don't you see that red thing over there? Just open it. And the guy wanted their usual traditional filter, pour water machine. And that's the technology the guy used. I said, well, he can use the other, it's better. He said, oh, sorry, sir, I can't use it. I don't know how to use it. You see, it was not the appropriate kind of labor. And so I had to urge a person that helps me to rush to Home Depot, buy a American coffee machine, the filters and so on, take it home because the poor guy could not make a cup of coffee that morning. So it depends, yes. That's in fact, I mean, this thing is fascinating because we could go on forever just on this slide. The process of economic development is 90% the one we just described. But we'll get to that in a moment. It's actually one of the reasons why it's important to distinguish constant increasing or decreasing return. I will get to that in a moment. All right, now let me go to this slide briefly because that's okay. I mean, I'm happy you're asking questions finally. So if you take longer than usual, we'll cut off something. Now there is a literature which is not very successful, I think, in economics, but it's popularly very successful. Lots of philosophers and people talk about it. Honestly, I'll be very frank, I think it's a lot of bullshitting. But I'm always being open to debate with these people that they never want to, right? And the idea is that you cannot separate a technology from the legal and cultural environments in which it operates. I think you can. And the fact that the legal and cultural environment and even the moral and ethical environment adapt to a given technology is an interesting process to study. But the technology that uses slaves for agricultural production is a technology that uses slaves. And the fact that then in certain societies, you adapt to it even morally, and you think it's fine to use slaves, and in other you don't, or in other before you do and then you don't, like the British one, between the 17th and the 18th century, it's also an interesting thing to study. Why did the British people, or the elites of the British people, or whatever, you can give your different, decided to abolish slavery uniformly in the country where it was already abolished and in their colonies, whereas other citizenship at the same time did not do that? It's an interesting question. Was that pure economic convenience or lack of it? So the technology that used slavery was no longer convenient from the point of view of the people living in the United Kingdom, but was convenient from the point of view of the people living in Georgia? Not sure, but for sure, I know that I can analyze the technology of using slaves, and I'm using a very brutal example intentionally, separately from the moral and cultural and legal environment in which it is used. And I can study their interaction, and that's an interesting topic. It's an interesting topic to ask how one adapts to the other, how one may change the other, or vice versa. Okay? So true, technologies are always embodied and embedded in a given historical environment, but they exist per se. And it's analytically useful to separate from the historical environment, then to put them back in. It depends what question you're asking. It depends what question you're asking. And finally, this is a topic of passion of mine. Are social mechanism technologies? Yes, they are. What is the social mechanism? Well, it's one of the millions of things that put you in place. They give you a role. Yeah, that's a technology. Education is a technology, and one of the things education does is to give people roles. The sanitary system is a technology, and it creates people that are sick and people that are healthy, and it defines and classifies people. Nothing wrong in treating that as a technology, and there's nothing wrong in recognizing that I can study social mechanisms, such as the old system, the classification. Let's take again the extreme cases so everybody understands. You know, if you ever read Foucault, Naissance de la Clinique, and all the literature on that, you'll see, you know, the guy has he charges it morally, but you can step away from his moral emphasis and say, yes, there is a technological aspect in some social mechanism, and psychiatry that has redefined hundreds of times who's crazy, who's not, who's normal, who's abnormal, subnormal, pro-normal, extra-normal, paranormal. Sure, it's like technological innovation. I can decide to look at it from an ethical point of view and take a stance. And trust me, you can take many different stances. There is no just one, not just the Foucault one or the Basaglia one or the Cooper's one, okay? But it's also technology, and there is nothing wrong with that. This is for those of you that are more interested in, how can I say, philosophical approaches to this, but there will be a lot to say, but not the moment. So this way, right? You see, I was prepared. You anticipated me. Why is that important? It's important for the reason I said, but it's important for many other reasons. With constant return, the size of a firm is not important. In fact, with constant return, it's not obvious that you need firms. Why? Imagine what constant returns mean. Constant returns mean if I want to produce, let's use the example with only one output, then you can easily. So if I want 100 units of something, I have to use a certain amount of X1, certain amount of X2, certain amount of X3, certain amount of X4, and so on. That's the input. If I want 200 units, all I have to do, just double it. If I want 300 units, triple it. This doesn't talk about a firm. Notice there is no firm here. There is only an activity. The primitive notion here is an activity that exists independently from a firm is a bundle of property rights. A firm is something, I don't know if it is more complex. Yeah, it's more complex than an activity because it includes an activity. It's an activity, in fact, it's a bunch of activities because a firm may use very different technologies, or at least have them available if they don't use it simultaneously. It's an activity or a bunch of activities plus a system of property rights and social roles. I give orders to you, you give orders to me. She has that role, he has that other role. Somebody takes risks, somebody pays, somebody does not pay. The buck stops somewhere, somebody has a residual claimant, and so on and so forth. Okay? So firms are a lot more complicated object than activities. They're not primitive notion. That's a big, for those of you that have a theoretical penchant, that's a big mistake and limit of the Ottobre approach that assume there exist firms. This is for economic theorists. So this is a bit of a jump from the introductory level to the high level. If you look at the theory of general equilibrium, the existence of proofs by Ken Arrow and Gerard Debreu, and you look at Debreau's famous book called Theory of Value, he assumes as primitives the firms. But firms are not a primitive. Firms are an economic object. In fact, Ronald Coase, many others, but Ronald Coase in particular, then Williamson and many others, Jacques Lafond, if he had been alive, you know, Jean Tirole and many, and Arrow Dempsey did not get it, and Armin Alchen did not get it, but they should, and George Stigler did. You know, lots of people got prizes. And why? Because they asked, what is a firm? How do you come around with a firm? How do you organize? What are the economic motives that lead people to have firms of a certain size? Under constant return, if all that there exists in production was inputs, output, activities, and constant return, there would be no firms. So obviously firms imply that information is not distributed uniformly and equally across people. Firms imply that there are problems with paying factors their market price because there is some degree of unknown risk that somebody has to absorb. There are various reasons. This is a beginner course, so I will not get into this, but I want you keep in mind that it's very important to distinguish between constant return, decreasing return, increasing return, in particular if you ask, what is a firm? Ronald Coase asked a very simple question, I think very deep. He said, why do we have firms in which decisions are not driven by prices, by orders? He orders you to do something because in the firm, hierarchical organization is above you. End of story. He doesn't say, would you like to do this for a price? And then do demand supply. No, he says, just do that. Okay, it's part of your duties. Okay? So that's one important reason. So I will not be able to talk about the theory of the firm in this class. Even the thing we started, just that is enough. Remember, I started out by saying capitalism is a particular economic organization in which there are firms and they have a particular legal structure. They're limited liability firms. In Italiano, società per azione. And therefore, capitalism requires a set of knowledge that makes limited liability firms possible. Not only a set of knowledge, also a set of property rights and legal system and judges and so on and so forth that makes a limited liability company possible, and therefore double entry bookkeeping as well. So I said capitalism is whatever started after double entry bookkeeping, not before. Okay? So that's constant. Decreasing, I already showed an example, but in general, we want to separate constant for decreasing return because when we observe that, for example, growth slow down So that a country that was growing, or a company that was growing at a certain rate, with apparent no change in external circumstances, grows at a smaller rate, we have to ask what's going on. One possibility, it doesn't have to be the only explanation, but one possibility is they open up a new plant, but the new plant is less productive than the previous ones because they cannot find workers and managers and technicians as good as those that they had before. For example, something I know directly, Starbucks. Starbucks has timed its growth at the speed at which they're able to train their personnel at every level and guarantee the supply of the same goods. So Starbucks is a fantastic example of constant return at work within a firm. And it's an intentional choice of constant return in the sense that they intentionally, whenever they open up a new, they go to a new country, open up a new branch, they want to make sure that the quality is the same. So personnel has to be the same. And because producing the new inputs, the new workers, takes time, you cannot just open up 1,000 new branches. You have to go at a certain speed. And they have been very good. One thing, people like me, when you go around the world, you like Starbucks is because it may not be the best coffee in the world, but it's very reliable. It's the same everywhere. So no surprise. And that's a lot, okay? And then finally, increasing returns. I don't think increasing return exists. I think increasing return are a misnomer. All the examples are typically given for increasing return are changes of technology. So I don't even debate. I just ask the usual question. There is no increasing return. Can you contradict me with an example of an activity or a technology that has increasing return? Increasing return means that, again, I increase one or more of those inputs that before I call X1, X2, X3, here, where are they? I increase this, okay? Or all of them. Maybe I double all of them, okay? Double input and triple output. Or more than double out, doesn't have to be triple, okay? So if you can show me a technology in which you double the inputs and the output more than double, then I buy you dinner. A very good dinner at a place I like. Okay? So we are going to have beer with the class on the 25th. If somebody comes up with a robust example of increasing return, we'll drink champagne instead of beer. This is open even to those that have not come to class because they're afraid that we infect them. All right? Now, why am I so insisting? Because unfortunately, there's no time definitely to talk about this. In the last 40 years, we abused the notion of increasing return to explain everything. And we really have abused it to a point that it's become meaningless. So I think it's very important to say, well, show me an example of increasing return. Don't just say. So within particular, I'll give you the words. There is one area where people keep insisting, oh, that's evidence of increasing return, and it's not. And it is the following, that it's known as the Kaldor-Verdun law. And it's one of the worst nonsenses that go around economics. So Verdun observed, using, I think he was New Zealandese or something, anyhow, British data, or either UK or Australia, that there was this kind of regular relation in the data until the 40s, because he was looking data before World War II, so very old data, in which aggregate output would go up and productivity would go up at a more or less constant rate, okay? So increase output of 3%, productivity increase of 2%. Increase output again of 3%, productivity increases again of 2%. Kaldor decided to interpret this evidence in the reverse order. And it says, because output went up X%, it caused productivity to go up. Therefore, there are increasing return. Why? Because if the aggregate production function has increased your return, the more you produce, the more productive you become. Okay? And so if really the process of growth over decades could be captured by a simple aggregate production function with constant return, with constant technology, you could say, well, look, everywhere, output during the last decades, since 2 centuries ago, has gone up, and productivity as well. So if I take Italy in 1850, productivity per hour worked was very low compared to today, and so was GMP. And you see, over the 170 years since, GMP has gone up and productivity has gone up. You see, there are increasing returns. Well, obviously, there was no fixed technology. This was the product of technological change, and the causation is obviously the other way around. It was technological change that increased productivity, and productivity increased output. But there is something, you can find it. In fact, I invite you to go read it, find it, and bring it back as a criticism to what I say next week, actually on Thursday. Kaldor never got anything right. The guy must be a disaster. Economics would have been a lot better without Nicholas Kaldor. Now some neo-Keynesian will go crazy about this, but I think Kaldor just did everything wrong. Kaldor Verdurn or Verdorn, because I think he was Dutch. I forgot what the country was, so I don't know what the correct pronunciation, but it's Verdoorn. And he was a statistician. He was a very humble statistician. He just pointed out there was this stable relation. And the stable relation, moreover, is not there. Obviously, the stable relation was there. It's a bit like Phillips was there. We have our visitor. What do you think it is? Well, those on video probably don't hear it, but it's as if somebody's shooting at us with a machine gun. Yeah, in fact, they're all invention, they're not facts. Yeah, Kaldor is responsible for both his growth laws all wrong and the Kaldor facts that are not facts.
And that's what they teach.
I know. And they also teach the aggregate production function. It's all bullshit. Hey, what can I say? I'm happy to debate the argument with any colleague in macro. I've been saying this since I started. I also teach those, but I also tell my student it's crap. It's not crap. At a certain point in time, the data agreed with Kaldor. So poor Kaldor, per se, he did not invent the numbers when he came out with that. But obviously being a bit pompous and a lord and British, and he was not British, I think he was Polish of origin. But he was at Cambridge and he felt very important. He decided those were universal law. And they were not. They were just statistical regularities for United Kingdom and United States until the 1940s. They became universal facts. Now you look at any other country, even during that period, there is no constant capital output ratio. There is no constant rate of return on capital. There are no constant factor share. I hope now, we agree. I've been one of the few saying that for decades, but now I think everybody agrees that factor share are not constant, okay? And so Kaldor facts are not facts. The only thing that probably there is, which is a bit strange, in United States, on average, over the last century and a half, total real output has been growing at a fairly constant rate that has oscillated over the decades around 2% per year. That's true. That's the only thing. And I think it's just chance. So, you know, if you plot, you can go to Fred and plot the output of the United States. This is very disturbing. Can somebody remind me to ask what the hell goes on? Because we cannot teach with this. This is the second time it happens. Can somebody go there and can just run up and see if there is something, some machine or something? Sorry, I mean, we're being machine gunned. Is that the light? Oh, it's the light. Oh, it's that. All right, well, we're almost done. Anyhow, so, you know, the only facts that survive of Caldor facts is the fact that true, in the United States, total output, not output per capita, but total output has been growing. You know, if you plot the logarithmic, it's very close to 2%. There's some huge oscillation, right? There's the productivity slowdown, now there's another one, there's the big recession, there is the Great Depression. So, but it's the only one, and it's probably a chance because it's not true in China, it's not true in Japan, it's not true in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, it's not true anywhere. So just chance. Okay? Okay, so I think we should finish here. Today, there is the interesting part here, technological change, but given that the next class is growth, right? Am I remembering right? It's growth, right? We're talking about growth. This is fine because obviously technological change and growth are related. So we can start, go look at Caldor Verdure, please do. And you know, it's good to look at data and try to see. And that's, the key will be, do we live in a world of aggregate increasing returns in which if we expand arbitrarily demand, productivity will increase and technological change will follow as a consequence? Or is it something different? And so we can start from there, okay? All right. I'm sorry, Ali John Nodirov asked the question, could you please the point of how education is related with technology? Please, if I don't see your chat, because sometimes I don't see it, stop me and say it so I can answer you. You know, just turn on the microphone. All right, take care. I'll see you Thursday. Remember, Thursday the class is on Zoom because I have to go work. All right, take care. Bye-bye.